give you a little bit of background about the Last Scene project that Judy started. Was it 2017? Is
Yeah.
that when it started taking off?
Yeah.
So Judy, do you want to give them a little bit of where you started?
Sure. So the project started in 2017, as Signe said, and we thought that we find maybe a few hundred of these advertisements taken out by formerly enslaved people, placed in Black newspapers after the war, in which they were looking for family members from whom they'd been separated in the domestic slave trade. We started modestly with this idea that we'd find a few hundred of these advertisements and place them on a website so that they would be available for genealogists who don't have access to subscription services that we have at a university library. That's where it started. I've, it's really taken off since Signe became my co-director. And we are closing in on today, closing in on 5,000 of these advertisements. And they come from hundreds of newspapers. When we started, we were really just looking at one that's still published here at AME Mother Bethel Church in Philadelphia. And it now includes newspapers from across the country and some newspapers published in Great Britain as well.
So that's just a little bit of background about what the website is. And like I said, we're going to kind of walk through that a little bit later, but we want to just kind of give you some context, some historical context about the domestic slave trade, so that when you teach with Last Scene ads, as hopefully you all will, you have some kind of a context to provide your students. So one of the things that we need to think about with the domestic slave trade is that this is typically the period from about 1820 to 1860, right? So when we think about historical context, we can think about this as historians tend to call this period the Second Middle Passage, right? So we think about the transatlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage when enslaved people and captives were put on board the ships and trafficked to what is now the United States. We can think about the domestic slave trade in kind of a similar way, right? They're not put on ships. Most of the time they are marched overland in coffles, as seen in this illustration, or they are put on steamboats and shipped down rivers, or they're, we have ships that were also sailed out of ports, sailed around Florida and up through the Gulf of Mexico. So however they were dispersed, in formerly enslaved people were sent from the Upper South to the Deep South and Southwest via the domestic slave trade in this roughly 40-year period. So scholars estimate that there's something like 2 million transactions. So just around 1 million people were trafficked from the Upper South to the Deep South and Southwest through this process. Judy, did you want to add anything? Or
I always like to ask my students, what's the difference between calling it the domestic slave trade versus calling it the Second Middle Passage? Mm-hmm. And it always becomes very apparent to them, what the change in naming practices means about the way we visualize this, that this is as disruptive and as violent of a dispossession as is the Middle Passage that took people across the Atlantic.
Absolutely. And so when we teach about the domestic slave trade, I know we're all kind of, or when I was in the classroom in Texas, like we're kind of limited by what we teach, by what's in the TEKS, right? So when you're teaching about the domestic slave trade, when you're teaching about the social and economic and political factors that led to the Civil War, or even when you're teaching about these aspects of Reconstruction, right? Last Scene ads fit in both of these areas perfectly. And they're really a great resource to use with your kids, as we're going to kind of show you. So on the website, we have we have several really amazing maps that you can use with your students in the classroom. We obtained the rights to both of these from the New York Public Library. And you can see the one on the left shows you the changing demographics over, I think it's a 40-year or 50-year period of time. So you can see your students, you and your students can actually see the growth, see the population change in these states as people are trafficked out of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and those states of the Upper South. And then the map on the right kind of gives you a larger overview of some of the routes that people were made to take, right? So you can help your students kind of visualize or understand the actual flow and movement of people across these spaces, right? A lot of the ads will mention, I was sold here, or I was taken from this place to this place to this place, like we're going to show you. So having this here for your students, it really kind of helps them visualize what this process might have looked like, you know, kind of up from above, right? From, you know, if you zoom out, what are these forced immigration patterns look like? All right, so I think we're ready to go. We have, did I cover everything there, Judy? We just, you know, team teaching on Zoom is kind of hard, right? Did I get the big points? Do you have anything to throw in?
And I would just say, if you're kind of leaning in like me to see things on your screen, just know that, because I'm always doing that. So just know that all of these resources are available on the website, and you can download them and blow them up or print them out or put them on your own slideshows. So I just wanted to let you all know that everything that you're seeing tonight is going to be available on the website for you to use in whatever form works for you.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we wanted to do is that we wanted to have you experience the ads as most people experienced the ads when they were initially published. These ads, most of them are meant to be read out loud. They were disseminated through church newspapers. They would have been disseminated by word of mouth. They were spoken in church, in Sunday sermons, in, I guess probably not mass, it's probably not very Catholic, but in Sunday sermons, in church services, and throughout the church community. So we actually have some of these on the website where we partnered with SiriusXM, and they had some professional voice actors read a couple of our ads. So you see the text here, but we wanted you to experience it how they were meant to be experienced. So I'm going to play this audio.
Listen in to this depiction of Henry and Sandy Anderson looking for their family members.
I would like to find my people. I was born in Somerset County, Maryland, and my master's name was John Anderson of Eastern Shore, Maryland. I left about 37 ago. Mother's name was Peggy. She had a husband named Adam Langford. He was my stepfather. My brothers were George, Alexander, Charles, Horace, Sandy, and myself, Henry. My brother George got drowned in Montgomery, Alabama in Alahoma River. John Anderson, my master, died in Baltimore, Maryland before I left, but was brought home on King Branch, 5 miles from Princess Anne County. I left 2 sisters in Maryland, Melinda and Sarah Ann. My master's wife was named Leah Jane Anderson. She had children named John and Laymew. My Aunt Harriet was married to Simon Parker. My cousins were Moses, Daniel, Light, and Ike. Harriet Parker was their mother, a sister to my mother, Peggy. The widow Dryden was our neighbor and W.M. Barnes. Master had a man named Bob, but his name was Bob Miles. His wife was named Melvina. Thomas Gatewood is in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, a brother to James Gatewood of Norfolk, Virginia. Sally Curtis is in Hampton, Virginia, a daughter of Patsy and Bob Reed. If anyone can give any information on my people, please address Henry Anderson or Sandy Anderson, Mineola, Texas, Wood County.
So as you can see, these ads are really chock full of information that can be used by both genealogists, but also by teachers to teach the domestic slave trade. As the author, as the actor was reading the ad, you can imagine alongside with your students what these searches, the way these searches took place. As Signe was saying, these ads were placed in Black newspapers, and they were often followed by requests for ministers and pastors to read them out loud at their congregations. And oftentimes ministers and pastors actually signed on to these advertisements. So you are hearing them in the sort of context in which they were meant to be heard. So each one of these ads would, be placed in the newspaper, and then ministers and pastors would read them out loud. And then you can imagine that the information in the advertisements was then carried by word of mouth or grapevine throughout a community or various communities, so that the voices of the people named in these ads would be amplified. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, there was not a resettlement agency or sort of a UN operation that took down the names of all 4 million formerly enslaved people and tried to find their family members. So, and helped them to find their family members. There are agencies like the Freedmen's Bureau. I'm sure you're already thinking about that. And even Union, soldiers on the ground and hospital staff, all of those people, agents of the federal government were, pressed upon by formerly enslaved people to help them find their family members. But really the most important sources for finding family members came from within the Black community and these Black communities throughout the country. And these advertisements take us right into the middle of that context. So the vast majority of the advertisements that we include were published in these Black newspapers, and they were meant to be read out just like we heard this one read out loud. And as you can see, and as you will see in your breakout groups in a little while, in order to begin to analyze the story told in the advertisement, you can read it line by line, and each line, it's like an onion, right? It just keeps giving you more and more information about this family. In this case, Henry Anderson, who began his life on Eastern Shore, Maryland, which is, I'm sure a lot of you are already thinking about Frederick Douglass and some other well-known people who also began their lives enslaved in these communities. And then Anderson was sold, and then he wound up in Mineola, Texas, at the time this ad was placed. And then he is by this time a grown adult. He's probably maybe what we would consider sort of middle-aged. I would think he would be young, but that's just me. 19th century. And he has kept a lot of information with him all of these years and is now sharing it in the form of really a family, his family's story here. He pours it into this short ad, and it's full of information, as I suggested, that you can use to explore the experiences of enslaved people as they traveled the Second Middle Passage. And then, during, in the way as some of the other ads get even more explicit about the period of the Civil War. And then you can follow these people into Reconstruction. So the ads follow people throughout the sort of their entire lifespan. And you can use the ads to teach any one of those topics or all of them. So I would say, I think we're going to walk you through, or should I walk them through? Should we walk them through this ad specifically, do you think, Signe?
Yeah, so let's do that and then we'll break out. So 2 things in the chat, somebody asked what year this ad was placed, and it actually appears in the Richmond Planet, which is an African-American newspaper published in Richmond, Virginia. The ad appeared February 16th, 1895. So 30 years after emancipation, which I find fascinating that 30 years after emancipation, people are still holding out hope. They're still actively engaged in the search for their family. Makes sense, right? But we have ads as late as 1920 in our collection. So if you think about that, that's, almost 60 years after emancipation. The tenor of the ads change. They're not looking for their parents anymore. They tend to be looking for siblings, but it's a testament to the dedication, the determination to reconstruct their families. So like Judy was saying that we can use these ads to teach about Reconstruction. So how I approach them when I use them in my classrooms I use them in both African American history class that I teach and the Civil War class that I teach. And the survey, I think about, usually we think about teaching Reconstruction from the top down. What's going on at the government? What's going on in the state level? Who's going to Congress? Who's being elected to the Senate? I use these ads to show what's happening on the ground, right? How are formerly enslaved people reconstructing their families? And I think students can kind of connect to that on a different level. So before we kind of break into that, and then somebody else in the chat asked if more of the ads are placed after emancipation or later, and the answer is yes. We start to see a really I don't want to call it. There's a lot of ads placed in the immediate aftermath. We see pretty consistent 65, 66. We see an uptick. And then right around, what do you say, like 68, 69, they start to dwindle a little bit, or
Yeah.
70, 75-ish?
In the 70s, and then they remained steady.
Yes.
Yeah, and we were shocked to find ads in the 20th century. I remember the day that we were talking to some teachers in Philadelphia about this, and somebody said, "Have you checked the Chicago Defender?" And I said, "No, we haven't checked the Chicago Defender." And I thought, there's no way we're going to find them in the Chicago Defender, which didn't start publishing until 1905 or 07. And sure enough, they appear in the Chicago Defender. So yeah, and I noticed in the chat somebody's talking about literacy, and that's a really great point to bring up, that bears a consideration. Both in the way that we started this presentation off with, with the ad being read, because, that allows the ad to reach people, whether they're reading the paper or not reading the paper, whether they can or cannot read. But also, I think that's a great question to think about too. And it reminds me of, the mention of Frederick Douglass, who learned to read because he, figured out a way to sneak that learning, to figure out how to do that on his own. When we're reading these ads, or when we're looking at these ads with our students, there's lots of, there are a lot of ways to sort of unpack the way in which, some of these, some of the idiosyncratic spelling of names, for instance. I talk to my students about that and sort of imagine what it would be like to have never seen your name spelled, but only have heard it. Or, or alternately, people who, not your own name, but your, a sibling or a parent who you hadn't seen for decades, and you might have attained literacy since then, but you never saw their name spelled. You only remember the way it sounds. And you can see in the ads, you can see some of that. Like if you're looking at Anderson's ad there, my master's wife was named Lair Jane Anderson, which could be sort of a different spelling of her first name, or it could be that her husband was a lawyer. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways in which you can sort of think about the challenges of finding family members when you have been prohibited from learning to read, and then, learning to read later in your life, and then, having the opportunity to go to a newspaper, or getting somebody's help to go to the newspaper, and then just pouring out all of the details that you have, kept in your, in your heart all these years, and trying your best to spell them as you would imagine that they would be spelled. Also, Laura is another that's really good. That's another really good possibility. It's any of those. I as you begin to explore these ads, I think it's a great opportunity to keep all of those, all of those options open, and have them think about how these ads lie at the intersection between, sort of written communication and oral communication. And not only for this generation that, again, took to the newspapers the first opportunity they could, but also, for us now. And, I tell my students, that imagine what it would be like to sort of pour out your whole life story in well, maybe they're pretty good in texting. I couldn't couldn't do that in a text. It would be awful, but or a tweet or something. If you were confined to your whole life story in a short amount of time, and if a lot of these Black newspapers didn't, publish these ads for free, but sometimes they charged people to place these ads. So imagine the kinds of questions or the kinds of choices, impossible choices you would have to make in order to sort of put everything that you could imagine would be useful in finding a family member out there like that.
All right, so do we want to break down one of the ways that we can, or some of the ways that we can start to analyze this ad before we send them out to do different ads?
I can go. Maybe I'll just go. I'm sure you're all very eager to get to your own ads, but maybe I can just walk you through just a little bit of how it is that we analyze these ads. And I did note in there a couple of questions that I want to make sure I address. I also agree with Matthew Mendoza about a great activity to have them write it traditionally and then have them text it. I think that's brilliant. One of the activities we have on the website has the students sort of having somebody, I think, or when we talked about anywhere, we had students read the ad, and then we had somebody else try to write down as much information as they could hear, them saying, just to sort of see how reliant we are on seeing things versus hearing things. And I think your idea is great, Matthew. And then Kathleen's question. Yes, the answer to Kathleen's question, which is, did people post the same ad repeatedly? Yes, they did. You will see as you start to explore the website, ads sometimes have a little number at the bottom, and it depended on the different newspapers. They did this differently, but that number indicated if a person was taking out an advertisement more than once, it might say a number there, which meant 2 weeks in a row or 6 weeks in a row. And then we also have people who took out different, you'll only find one copy of every ad, hopefully. We try not to have repeats there, but some people did change their advertisement after they found, if I was looking for my mother and my father and my siblings, and I found some of my siblings, that I might take another follow-up ad and say, well, I found 2 of my siblings, but I'm still looking for somebody else. So you can trace families through that way as well. Okay, so when we're looking at this advertisement, a few things are important. And the first one, of course, one of our listeners already pointed out, was to make sure we get the place and the date of the advertisement, which is the first thing, of course, we need to write down, because and also to get out your calculator, which I always use on my phone, right? Because there's going to be a lot of math, right? So we know this advertisement was taken out in 1895, I think.
1895 in Richmond, the Richmond Planet.
Right. So immediately we're going to be starting to do some math. So as we're reading this, we see that Mr. Anderson is looking for a number of people. And as we already said, he's coming from, Maryland. And he's giving us the name of his enslaver, John Anderson. So that's all really important information. And as everybody knows, it's difficult to follow enslaved people through the records. It's sometimes easier to follow their enslavers through the records. So we definitely want to keep a running sort of list of names here that we might want to sort of think about and what that meant, what that means for people today trying to find their family members, but also for us, for Henry, to sort of send up these various flags. Here are my family members, but here are some other, here are some white names that people might know as well. And then we have our first year, which is always helpful. So we hear from Mr. Anderson that he left Maryland 37 years ago. So we can take out our calculator, boop, 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 boop. We can do the math, right? And we can start to get some numbers, which I won't do in front of you because I'm terrified to do math in front of other people. But that's going to be, that'll be important for us to sort of situate him in time and place. So when was he in Maryland? What was happening in Maryland at the time? When is he making this? When is he being separated from his family? When does he start to make this cross-country, trek in the Middle Passage? Then he also he's giving us his mother's name, and she and her husband, his stepfather, and so those are all, again, names that we want to keep track of. They usually, all of these ads will often, they'll, if they're looking for the entire family, they'll give us mother, father, and then they'll start to list siblings. Like he does here, he's giving us the name of all of his siblings, also names himself, helpfully. And then you get the, and then with Mr. Anderson, you get this, reality check here about the death of one of these children, his brother, George. And because he knows his brother was drowned in Montgomery, Alabama, that raises some questions for us, because if he's in Maryland, how does he know that his brother, how does he know about the status of his brother? Was his brother sold away before him? And or did Mr. Anderson, his enslaver, take his brother there? And so, questions surrounding the accident of his brother's death. But also interesting, of course, for Henry, he keeps, his list stays complete with the name of his brother. And then Henry Anderson gives us another breadcrumb there when he tells us about the death of his master, his enslaver, and that his, so his enslaver wasn't at his residence when he died, but then brought him home. And then we also get the information about exactly where the enslaver lived, and hopefully maybe that'll give us some more information about Henry.
So I always, can I just jump in? So I always think it's interesting here to just finer points. Like, I think it's interesting that he refers to his mother had a husband, because enslaved people are not allowed to formally marry. So that tells you something about the relationship between his mother and her husband, but does not say that that's his father, right? So he was my stepfather, which is also interesting, because I think students will kind of key in, oh, that's actually what they called a stepfather, right? Like, my students are always like, oh, I didn't know that was a term that they would have used in 1858. So I think those things are interesting, because then it also raises the question of, where is Henry's father, right? Like, how do we put these pieces together?
Right. Yeah. And if you remember reading, again, Frederick Douglass's earlier life, there's, the Eastern Shore of Maryland is very interesting. There's large free Black population in Eastern Shore, Maryland, which makes it quite possible that you could kind of have these mixed families of some free Blacks and some enslaved people all in the same family, or married, right? So you could have a married couple, who like Douglas, right, whose wife was free. So you could have that kind of dynamic operating here also. So yeah, thanks. Yeah. A good point to bring up. Just the use of the term husband, wife, of course, it can give us the opportunity to remind our students that all of this stuff was not recognized by these states. Yet that didn't matter in the way that people understood their families and described their families, to use the same language, right? Yeah. And then things get even more interesting when we talk about his sisters, because women have this inconvenient habit of changing their names, which always makes it, harder to find people if you're trying to find people, but also interesting to sort of think about the complications of, that people faced when they were trying to find their family members. And of course, all of too, right, when people become free, they often change their names as a sign of their freedom, because they're shedding the names given to them by enslavers. And so when we get to, Henry's talking about his sisters there, it gives us the opportunity to think through with our students what it means to have people's names not be stable, and how that can complicate your search, as a formerly enslaved person. Yes, and then he, interesting that he gives, then he gives us the name of his enslaver's wife, who, after his, the male enslaver, after he died, right, this is an important thing, because now, right, she would be in charge of kind of what would happen next, depending on what the status of his estate is. So, right, it's a good opportunity. There's a lot of ads that describe a sale that was precipitated by the death of a master or an enslaver. That is very common in these ads. People understand, right? Enslavers told enslaved people all sorts of lies about why they had to sell them away. But enslaved people in these ads know very well why these sales occurred, and they often occurred after the death of an enslaver, that estates were broken up. And that meant that a young boy like Henry, was sold away from his family. There were some questions coming through. Signe, just stop me if there's questions.
No, I've been answering them in the chat.
Great, okay, great. You could always stop me, or yeah.
Yeah, no, I think the tag team kind of thing works, because I think it kind of makes sure that everything gets covered.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, I find it, the Andersons are again, fascinating. This Eastern Shore connection is fascinating because he's got also this extended family. So we're not just hearing about Henry's, mother and his siblings, but we're hearing about aunt. Her name was Harriet, and who she was married to, a man named Simon Parker. You have all these, lovely names of cousins here. So we get a sense of an extended family, and obviously likely a family that goes back several generations in the Eastern Shore, because you have this extensive family tree that's already becoming very clear by Henry's ad. It also just, gives you the opportunity to think about like just how, just the pain of losing all, like just being ripped away from everything you knew and all of these people, and being sent to Mineola, Texas, which I didn't know where, I had to figure, there was a lot of geography there that I had to like imagine what that would have been like for him to live his whole life in the Eastern Shore with all of these, relations, and then wind up in Mineola, Texas. He's also then going into, so we've got all these cousins operating here, the relationship between, the aunt and his mother. And then we get some more information here about some other people from the old neighborhood, which, some of these names might be white names. Again, if you're sort of thinking about how people reconstruct their families after slavery, one of the things that, is always sort of interesting to think about is some of the ads are describing entanglements, between Black and white families, and how complicated that would be for enslaved people, when they begin this process of reconstructing the family, they have to make choices about who they decide is their family and who's not their family. Are they going to name, white people as members of their family the way that white people did when they were their enslavers, always, my family, Black and white? Or are free people choosing to, they're defining their family the way they see their family. So it's a great activity to sort of think about with students, to sort of think about, how do we know which of these people are white, which of them, are enslavers, who are free, and how has that changed depending on where they are? Again, like the Eastern Shore, where you have a very mixed population of free people. And then we've got, again, that whole paragraph there, I would say is or at least the beginning of that paragraph seems to be, it could go either way. When he's talking about this Barnes and this Miles and then Melvina. And then interestingly, he knows about some family who live in Pennsylvania, and somebody who lives in a couple of people who live in Virginia. So those are interesting, because then you can sort of, with your students, sort of imagine how it is that this guy who winds up in Mineola, Texas, knows, but he came from Maryland. How does he know that he has somebody in Pennsylvania to whom he's related? And how does he know about these relatives in Virginia? And those are great opportunities for us to think about the transmittal of information, again, not just through these ads, but through the grapevine and through word of mouth. Anderson's been plugging away. So we have an ad here that takes a snapshot of a moment in time in this search. But clearly there's more going on, because Henry has come to this ad with information that's likely been updated since he's, since he was separated from his family, or, or we can at least ask that question. How does he know that he has these families in Pennsylvania and in Virginia? And then finally, I would just leave it with, it's always great when, they give us obviously they give us their name. They don't always do that, but then he's added somebody else there who's got the same last name as him. So, he signs it, his name is Henry Anderson. And then there's this other person who's signing it, who's Sandy Anderson, and we don't know who that is yet. Sometimes, the people who are signing it with them are pastors or somebody who's going to help them. So there's an open question about Sandy that remained open. I did, full disclosure, I spent a lot of time on this family, and that was, and it turns out Sandy's pretty important to the story, but that's just, I don't want to spoil so I guess, I'm sorry that took a little longer than I expected, but I guess the point is, each sentence, each line bears a moment for us to sort of think through as teachers with our students about how much detail and how much sort of can we learn about this moment in time and the moments that preceded it, about the lives of enslaved people and then freed people, and how they sought to reconstruct their families.
And this ad it's one of my favorite ads on our site. And Judy, can I give them the spoiler? Because we're not going to talk about it. This ad is one of 7 ads placed by this family in this community in Mineola, looking for family all over, right? So like, if you look at this set of ads, you really get an idea of just the relentless search and their attempts, like not just Henry's and not just Sandy's attempt to put their family back together, but one ad will reference, we found somebody, or my sister found somebody, and you can see them, trying to pull all of these threads to reassemble their family. And I think it's amazing. And 2, because it gives us a snapshot or a window into, people will talk about how enslaved people were separated, torn apart from their families. And you think about that dislocation. And here you see the attempt to put those things back together, because you don't want to just, when you teach slavery, when you teach about the domestic slave trade, you just don't want to talk about numbers, right? If you don't want to talk about 1 million people were trafficked, you want to talk about that, but that can't be your focus. You want to make your students see that they were people, that they were separated from families, that this meant every person that was sold meant that a family was being torn apart. So this makes that personal, which I think will pull students in. I think it gives them something to connect to. And we don't want to get there because I don't want to go too far off track, but you could totally bring into contemporary events, right? Thinking about family separations. So these ads have a lot to offer when you can get them into the classroom. So I love them, and not just because I work on the project. So this is one of the maps that Judy wanted to include when we were thinking about how, like she mentioned, like the flow of information, thinking about how we can, how the information got from one place to another, right? Like how does that look? So Judy and I were talking, we were reading through these ads and discussing these possibilities, and I was like, well, what about the railroads, right? Like, could that be an avenue for the dissemination of information? So then, Judy found this map, and lo and behold,
right,
it's coming right through Mineola, right?
Like 3 of them, like in that little triangle there, all the way on the right. Mineola is like right there in that little triangle. It's right around there, and so they've got all sorts of, they've got all sorts of railroads coming in and out of that town. So it makes sense that they've got ads in all these different newspapers, and they're placing them to try to find their various family members.
Yep.
They've also got a prison labor camp in Mineola, where free people are, being charged for trespassing and thrown in jail, and then being made to build those railroads that are snaking the way across East Texas.
Right, so let's go to, we want you to kind of get into these ads. So what we're going to do is